This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee Bequest for the work of our team.
Hi, everyone. My name is Winifred Lewis. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Queensland.
Hey guys, I'm Austin Manchotti and I'm a research assistant on this project.
Hi everyone, I'm Yuqi Liu, UQ psychology student.
Yeah, and we're meeting today to record introductory chapters for all 38 of the chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. And in particular, we're working on chapter 16, Environmental Justice and Climate Justice. The author is Phaedra Pizzulo, and she is an associate professor in the College of Media, Communication, and Information at the University of Colorado Boulder. So I guess people might ask, what are climate justice and environmental justice, Austin?
Yeah, it's a really important question, obviously, particularly before you start the chapter. So environmental justice is basically saying environmental degradation and / pollution or whatnot are much more likely to be the concerns of people living in poverty or in harder conditions, or people or communities of color, where historical racism has definitely impacted their quality of life as compared to people who are much more affluent and aren't affected by it, living in their nice houses and apartment buildings. And then contrasted to that, climate justice basically says that all the pollution and the damage is disproportionate around the world, where it does impact poor people or minorities more, and they will have to suffer through it even though they've had the least impact on it.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess the author kind of starts the chapter with the start of the movement for environmental justice in the US, which was a famous instance of pollution and land poisoning in Warren County, right? Yuqi, tell us about that.
Yeah, so the Warren County case in American was talk about like a company who just dumped the waste and poisoned innocent people, and the government, in order to deal that, they just extracted all the contaminated soil and try to find a place to store it. However, like they choose the Warren County and to dump the soil. These actions has really impaired the local community's water system, which polluted and causing many problems. So the local community has sued them, which finally they win and increase the huge mobilization about the environmental protections.
Yeah, that's right. And part of what made it so shocking is that the EPA had these rules about where to put toxic waste dumps, and the choice of that community was going against their own rules because it was too close to the water table and the soil was too porous. And when they were sued, although the community eventually received some form of justice, the EPA defended themselves and said they were entitled to waive their own standards, and they won the first court case. So it was a real clear instance of the Environmental Protection Agency not working in the interests of actual people. And that was a criticism that a lot of people made of the environmental movement more broadly in the 1970s and 80s in particular, because the environmental movement, often the groups would refuse to take on cases of toxic poisoning, waste poisoning, chemical spills, industrial pollution, and they would call it community health issues. So they would really not mobilize. And that's even though it was obviously an environmental issue as well as a community issue. And more broadly, people started to point out that the environmental movement was staffed largely by middle-aged white men. And there was actually a report that came out in the 1990s that identified that like a disconcertingly large portion of the paid staff at these environmental groups was from this very narrow demographic, and they weren't including women and they weren't including people of color, and that was in their membership, let alone in their leadership positions. So they're increasingly criticized for this, and they actually started to change as a movement as a result, but it was a slow process, right, Austin?
Yeah. And the chapter is really great as it goes through, and it gives you sort of the 4 stages of the life cycle of a social movement. So I'll start with the first one, which is emergence, which is essentially just the creation of the beginning of it. And then it goes into mobilization, so the beginning to spread and how it affects people, and then into institutionalization, which is when it moves into the political sphere of things and can help influence decisions. And then finally, in Tilley's model, there's a decline sort of from those, or like repression, or they've achieved their thing, or it's failed basically. So it stops having such a big impact, you know. And like in the 1990s, there had a National Environmental Justice Advocacy Council was formed with labor leaders, sociologists, community leaders, that led an executive order in 1994 by Bill Clinton, passed, you know, to help the government offices. They tell them basically you should include environmental factors into your political decisions, you know. And because of this, institutionalization was achieved, but it also it leads potentially to issues down the road, because again, once you get institutionalization and money gets involved, you know, people may sell out, and there are other problems that can come with that. But there's another chapter in the book that talks about those issues there.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. So it's one issue to speak out an executive order that we should take that environmental justice into account in our decisions, and it's quite another thing to have monitoring and evaluation of the outcomes and enforcement when bad decisions are made. So I guess that kind of connects in with the climate struggle, where it's been a real difficulty to get traction. And tell us about the idea of climate justice there, Yuchi. What is that?
Yeah, so the climate justice is about like how we focus on to let everyone to facing these climate challenges in different communities, and also the race and sex. And this also including like some kind of 6 platform, and I will introduce a few in here. So that would be including like preventing the global warming, assisting impact communities, and fostering a just transition, etc., etc.
Yeah. And a just transition speaks to the idea that climate activists make in this space, which is that most of the carbon emissions come from the rich countries of North America and Europe, and they have historically kind of destroyed a lot of their forests and extracted forests and mines, minerals and oil from all over the world, and used it to build their own economies. But the communities and countries that are suffering are often relatively poor, and often countries where people live who are people of color. And so the idea of a just transition is that not everyone should be treated equally. The rich countries should pay more to make this transition, and not expect poor countries that are already suffering the ill effects of climate change to shoulder a burden as if they contributed in the same proportion. So I think those movements are, you know, really important. And I guess part of what the author says in the conclusion of the chapter is that they're driving new coalitions and new policies around the world, and they are achieving, you know, some high-profile symbolic victories like international accords and declarations. But when you look at the broader context, it hasn't always been implemented with justice, and the environmental movement still contains a lot of people who resist the idea of climate justice, that you know, that climate concerns require that we engage the rights of Indigenous peoples, and the concerns around just transitions and so on. So that kind of controversy is the way that the chapter ends. The author ends the chapter. I guess what I would say is that I found the discussion of the emerging climate justice movement really interesting and inspiring, particularly looking at the leadership of people in the global South. One of the movements that I hadn't heard of before this book was the Green Belt movement in Kenya in the 1990s, when a woman called Wangari Maathai started this amazing women's leadership program that eventually mobilized 80,000 women and led to planting literally millions of trees. And that kind of leadership is really not profiled. It's not taught in schools. That was kind of something that I came to with this chapter. It informed me about things that I didn't know a lot about, and particularly those examples around the world. What was your take home point from the chapter, or your closing thoughts or comments, Austin?
I think the biggest thing this chapter did, and a lot of other chapters in the past, a couple of chapters have done this previously, is it really helped shed light on a lot of the tragedies that was just not spoken about. I mean, I never learned in school about what happened in Warren County. I'd never even heard of it until I read the chapter, and I'm like, wow, you know, this is a really serious thing. You know, people need to know about this, need to know how it happens. So I think the chapter really does justice to, you know, telling people, look, this is a serious thing. This is what's happening. This is what's happening. So it's done a really nice job of doing that.
Yeah. What about you, Yuchi? What was your engagement with the chapter?
Yeah, so my idea, like the reflection from this chapter, is more about how we could respect the Aboriginal people, like in Australia, just like
Yeah,
these minority groups in America, like how we could respect their land and to make environmental and climate justice for every different race and communities. That's
yeah.
how it's important.
It
Yeah,
is important. And I think that's a really great way of finishing, challenging everyone to look not just over there at the US where bad things have happened and continue to happen, but in our own countries and how we can mobilize and support. I was just looking this morning in my email inbox at a group called, I think, Seed Mob, which is an environmental activist group of Indigenous young people. So that's just one of many examples that Australians could learn more about and connect with and support. But anyways, yeah, maybe we'll close there and I'll say thank you to you, Austin and Yuchi, for being part of the recording. And thanks very much to our viewers if you're here till the end of the chapter. Bye now.
bye.
Yeah. For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ, and check out our website for more videos.